June 12th, 1969. That's the exact date the water disappeared from beneath the American Falls at Niagara, and the exact date, according to a story Niagara County families have been passing down for more than 50 years now, that a work crew found stairs where there should have been nothing but broken rock. Not a few steps. A staircase, they said. Cut straight into solid stone, more than 30 feet across, wide enough to march an army down, descending into the dark, under a river that had been running over that exact spot for something like 12,000 years. Folks around Niagara still tell this one. You'll hear it in a bar off Pine Avenue, or from somebody's grandfather at a 4th of July cookout. Always a little different in the details, always the same in the shape of it. Something was found down there. Something was hidden, and nobody left alive who claims to have actually stood on that riverbed will say much more than that, not on the record, not with their name attached to it. People who were actually there, tourists and engineers alike, tended to remember the silence before they remembered anything else. The falls make a sound most people stop noticing after the first 10 minutes at the railing. A low, constant roar that gets into your chest and stays there. On the morning of June 12th, 1969, that roar simply wasn't there anymore. And by every account, real and legendary both, the quiet was the strangest part of the whole summer. Mist that used to hang permanently over Prospect Point thinned out and drifted off within days. The exposed rock, still wet from a river that had run over it for thousands of years, steamed faintly in the early sun and then dried grey and pale, streaked white in places with old mineral deposits nobody had ever seen before. Moss clung in the cracks and low pockets where the spray used to reach, going brittle and brown within a week without water to feed it. Cold air pooled in the deeper channels of the riverbed, even on warm afternoons, air that had sat under a waterfall for longer than anyone could reasonably guess. And every footstep on that bare stone carried a hard, flat echo that the roar of the falls had always swallowed before. It was, more than one visitor said at the time, less like watching a waterfall get turned off, and more like watching a wound get opened. Before we get into the parts nobody can prove, let's get straight on the parts anybody can check. Because the real story, the documented story, is strange enough all by itself. By the 1960s, the American Falls had a problem, and it wasn't a secret. Two major rock falls, one in 1931 and another in 1954, had dumped house-sized boulders at the base of the cataract, and that pile of rubble, engineers called it talus, had built up so high it was swallowing nearly half the fall's original drop. An estimated 280,000 cubic yards of it sat there by the mid-1960s. A small mountain of broken stone hiding the bottom of one of the most photographed waterfalls on Earth. Tourists complained the falls looked tired. One local paper, in 1965, ran a piece describing the American Falls as an old friend in failing health, and that kind of talk got loud enough that the United States and Canada eventually asked the International Joint Commission and the US Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District, to study what, if anything, could be done about it. Their answer was about as blunt as engineering gets. Turn the water off and look. Starting June 9th, 1969, more than 1,000 truckloads of rock and earth, something like 28,000 tons of it, went into building a temporary cofferdam 600 feet long, running from the New York mainland out to the tip of Goat Island. The American Falls only ever carried about 10% of the Niagara River's total flow to begin with, so pushing that 10% over the Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side instead was enough to get the job done. It took 3 days of round-the-clock dumping. By the morning of June 12th, the American Falls had gone silent for the first time in living memory, and the riverbed underneath lay open to the June sun, bare, dripping, and steaming faintly where the last puddles evaporated off the rock. Geologists went to work almost immediately, walking the exposed bed, driving core samples, mapping the fracture lines that had caused the 2 big collapses in the first place. Crowds came too. Eventually more than 100,000 of them over the course of the summer, driving up from Buffalo and beyond to stand at Prospect Point and stare at a Niagara Falls that wasn't, for once, falling. The studies ran on through the summer and into the fall. That November, the engineers reached their official conclusion. Clearing the talus pile would cost far more than it was worth, and the rock falls, dramatic as they were, amounted to nothing more than a cliff face doing what cliff faces do over centuries. Better, they decided, to leave it alone and let nature keep shaping it. On November 25th, 1969, the cofferdam was breached and the Niagara River came roaring back over the American Falls after more than 5 months of silence. That's the version you'll find in the engineering reports and the newspaper archives. It's also, if you believe the story, passed down through a handful of Niagara County families. Only half of what actually happened out on that riverbed. The story goes that the trouble started less than a week after the water dropped, on a stretch of exposed bed close under the Prospect Point overlook, not far from where the old cofferdam tied into the mainland. A foreman, most versions of the story name him Walter Kessler, was walking the site early one morning checking for loose rock underfoot when his boot caught an edge that was too straight to be natural. Real stone doesn't fracture in clean 90-degree angles very often. Not out in the open like that. Not after 12,000 years of ice and floodwater working it over. Kessler called 2 men over with shovels, and together they cleared away maybe 2 feet of wet silt and gravel that had settled into the crack. Underneath it was a step. Not a ledge. Not one of the countless natural shelves the gorge is full of, carved by centuries of freeze and thaw. A step, flat, level, with a riser that one surviving account puts at exactly 14 inches. And below that step, once they'd cleared away more silt, another one. And another. By the end of that first day, the story says, the crew had exposed 5 full steps and the top edge of a 6th, running the entire width of that section of riverbed. When somebody finally thought to run a tape across it, a young surveyor most versions name Thomas Bragg, the number that came back was just over 30 feet, wall to wall. Word of a strange discovery usually gets around fast, especially with 100,000 tourists a summer walking past that exact overlook. That's part of what makes this story stick the way it does. If a construction crew genuinely uncovered something like this on a public riverbed in broad daylight, you'd expect a photograph, a wire story, something more than a rumour. Believers point to exactly one piece of surviving paper. A short item said to have run in a local weekly on June 15th, 1969, mentioning an unusual rock formation near the American Falls construction zone. Printed without a photograph and never followed up on. Skeptics point out that nobody has produced that clipping in 50+ years of people looking for it. Believers say that's exactly the point. By every account handed down through the families who worked that job, the discovery didn't end at a staircase. Over roughly 2 weeks that June, according to the legend, crews clearing silt and broken rock under engineering supervision exposed what they started calling the wall. A stretch of tightly fitted stone that one lost survey sketch supposedly marked at close to 200 feet long, angling down and back beneath the riverbed, following the gorge rather than crossing it. The blocks in it, the story insists, were enormous, 6 to 9 feet across in places, squared off and set together so precisely that an old-timer once swore a knife blade couldn't find the seam between them. No mortar anywhere in it. No visible fasteners. Just mass and fit. The sort of stonework people usually associate with places a lot older and a lot farther from western New York than a public park on the US-Canada border. Survey stakes went in fast that June, numbered in sequence. The legend usually gives a run somewhere from NF-69-014 through the low 30s. Though nobody today can produce those field books outside of somebody's family memory. Elevations were supposedly logged against the construction benchmark set for the cofferdam project itself. A rough sketch, the kind foreman scratch out on the back of a supply requisition, is said to have shown the staircase descending at a steady pitch to a landing roughly 40 feet below the original riverbed grade, then continuing down a second run of steps toward an opening. The crew started calling, half joking at first, the door. That's where the story gets its teeth. The opening, according to every version, was sealed. Not naturally collapsed, but packed deliberately, with loose rubble that didn't match the surrounding stone in colour or type. Behind it, once a narrow gap had been cleared with hand tools, cold air came pushing out. One private journal, attributed to a county historian, most retellings call Miriam Halloway, a woman said to have kept detailed notes on the excavation that she shared with family rather than ever publishing, describes air rising through that gap that was a good 20 degrees colder than the June afternoon around it, and carrying a smell she could only liken to a cellar that had never once been open to daylight. A few men, the legend says, no more than 2 or 3, went in with lanterns before anyone in charge told them to stop. What they described afterward, filtered 40 and 50 years down through grandchildren and barroom retellings, was a tunnel wide enough to walk 2 abreast, its walls smoothed, rather than roughly hewn, sloping gently downward for something like 65 feet, before opening into a space too large for their lantern light to fully catch. A hall, the men called it, on the rare occasions they talked about it at all. A ceiling too high to find, with hand-carried light, held up, according to the story, by pillars thick around as grain silos, spaced out into the dark farther than any lantern could reach. Carvings ran along the wall near the entrance, spirals and long connected lines, the kind of pattern you'd sketch trying to represent something worn down by age rather than damaged by force, smoothed so thoroughly that nobody could say with confidence what they'd originally looked like. And past the pillars, right at the edge of where the light gave out before the men were called back to the surface, 2 flat slabs of stone stood upright against the hall's far wall, each one estimated at 12 feet or better, set like doors, though doors built on a scale that didn't seem to have a person in mind. 11 seconds. That number turns up again and again in the more detailed tellings. Somebody, testing the space out of simple curiosity, dropped a fist-sized stone past the sealed opening and let it fall. 11 seconds, by one account timed on a foreman's wristwatch, is how long the echo took to finally die out, bouncing between surfaces too far apart and too smooth to belong to any known natural cave system in that part of New York. Earl Voss doesn't appear in any surviving newspaper from that summer, but his family still tells his part of this story at reunions. By every version, he was a night watchman assigned to keep an eye on idle equipment near the excavation. And by every version, he was among the last people allowed anywhere near that sealed opening before everything changed. His granddaughter has said, in a few local radio interviews over the years, that he came home from that job a quieter man than he'd been before, and that he kept a short, handwritten account of what he'd seen that he never mailed and never fully explained to anyone. She says she still has the pages. She's never let a reporter photograph them, which either means there's nothing there worth photographing, or it means precisely what the legend wants you to think it means. Depends entirely who you ask. There's a second family story that runs alongside the Voss account, quieter but just as persistent. A woman named, in most versions, Dorothy Coswell, worked that summer as a payroll clerk in the site office near the cofferdam, and her grandchildren still describe her talking, late in her life, about a run of phone calls that came through the office switchboard in the space of about 72 hours. All of them logged to the same out-of-town exchange. None of them ever explained to her by the men who took them behind a closed door. She kept no notes, made no copies, and by her own account never asked a single question, because by 1969 she'd already worked enough government contracts to know exactly which questions got a person nowhere. Her family doesn't claim she saw the staircase or the wall or anything underground. They only claim she watched the office go quiet in a very particular way for 3 days in the middle of June, and that the quiet never fully lifted for the rest of that summer. There's supposedly a photograph too, though like everything else in this story, it exists at exactly one remove from anyone who could actually confirm it. The Coswell family is said to keep it in an old cigar box, along with ration cards and a handful of other keepsakes. A small, badly faded black and white print showing a stretch of stepped stone half buried in silt. A man's boot in the corner of the frame for scale. No date written on the back. No photographer credited. It's never been submitted to a historian, never been examined by anyone outside the family, and never will be, according to the one grandchild who's talked about it publicly, because handing it over feels less like proving a story and more like breaking a promise nobody in the family actually made out loud, but everyone somehow understood anyway. Whether that photograph shows a genuine archaeological find, an ordinary construction trench, or nothing more than a trick of bad lighting on wet gravel is, like nearly everything else here, a matter of which way you're already inclined to lean. If the story stopped there, it would already be the kind of thing that gets retold every Halloween in a Niagara Falls bar. But it doesn't stop there, and this is where it grows into something bigger than one construction season in 1969. Because if you go back further, decades further, even centuries further, you find pieces of this same story scattered across the whole history of that gorge, long before anyone was pouring cofferdams or measuring talus piles. Start close to home, less than a mile from where the staircase was supposedly found. The real Cave of the Winds, not the boardwalk attraction that carries the name today, but the actual natural cavern that once sat behind Bridal Veil Falls, was discovered by 2 college students in 1834 and opened to paying tourists by 1841. It was a genuine hollow space cut into the Lockport Dollarstone caprock of the gorge, roughly 130 feet high, 100 feet wide and 30 feet deep, and for close to a century, visitors walked directly behind a wall of falling water to stand inside it. Rockfalls plagued it from the start. One in 1857, a fatal one in 1920 that killed 3 tourists outright. And finally, after a catastrophic collapse in 1954, left the whole overhang unstable. Engineers made the call to finish the job themselves. In 1955 and 1956, crews packed the remaining cave with explosives and brought it down on purpose, sealing a genuine, well-documented natural cavern under the falls for good. 14 years before anyone claims to have found a staircase under the American Falls a few hundred yards away. Nobody needs to invoke any legend to explain that one. It happened. It's in the historical record, and it means the idea of authorities deliberately using dynamite to close off a hollow space beneath Niagara Falls isn't some wild leap. It's precedent. And go back further still and you reach Devil's Hole, a real site a few miles down the gorge from the falls, and the setting for a real, thoroughly documented piece of history. On September 14th, 1763, during Pontiac's rebellion, a large force of Seneca warriors ambushed a British supply convoy moving through that stretch of the gorge, killing the great majority of the soldiers and teamsters in the fighting that followed, one of the deadliest single engagements of that entire war. That part is settled history, not folklore. What is folklore, recorded by later writers rather than proven as fact, is the layer sitting underneath it. Descriptions of an actual cave beneath the rock outcropping at Devil's Hole, and a tradition said to have been relayed to the French explorer La Salle by his own guide roughly a century before the ambush, that the hollow beneath that stone was the home of a dangerous spirit, a place a person simply did not go down into. Whether that specific exchange happened exactly the way later writers recorded it is something historians can reasonably debate. What isn't in dispute is that long before any engineer ever touched Niagara, the people who actually lived along that gorge were already telling each other there were hollow places under the rock best left alone. Some Seneca families who have fished and lived along that stretch of the Niagara River for far longer than the town of Niagara Falls has existed, have spoken, in accounts passed down through households rather than published anywhere, of older traditions concerning spirits, said to dwell behind and beneath the falls, and of caves along the gorge that outsiders were never meant to open. Those particular stories don't originate with the 1969 legend, and it would be wrong to claim they do. But once word of a sealed stairway started circulating in the summer of 1969, it's not hard to see why people who already knew the older traditions started drawing a line between the two. Quarrymen add their own layer to it. Limestone quarrying was serious, dangerous business all along the Niagara escarpment through the 1800s. Feeding lime kilns and building stone as far as Buffalo and Rochester, and by every account handed down through a few of those old quarrying families, there were spots the veteran crews simply avoided. Places where a drill bit would strike what one family story calls a false floor, a hollow ring instead of solid rock, and the crew would move to a new face without much explanation offered to the younger men. Canal labourers, the ones who dug the locks and feeder channels that fed the industry growing up around Niagara's water power through the 19th century, told similar stories about certain stretches of ground near the gorge that nobody wanted to break first, ground that sounded wrong under a pick, in the words one old labourer's letter is said to have used. And the river fishermen, the ones working the lower Niagara for a living long before there was a tourism board to speak of, used to swear that on certain still mornings, a low booming sound carried up out of the gorge itself. A sound that didn't match the falls, didn't match the rapids, and seemed to stop the moment anyone tried to pin down exactly where it was coming from. None of that proves anything on its own. Old ground makes strange noises. Quarries have unstable pockets. Gorges echo in ways that play tricks on the ear. But stack all of it. The dynamited cave at Bridal Veil, the older Devil's Hole traditions, the quarrymen's false floors, the canal diggers' bad ground, the fishermen's booming mornings. Next to a 30-foot staircase, a whole work crew supposedly found under the American Falls in June of 1969. And the pattern stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like a story the Gorge has been trying to tell for a very long time, in pieces, to whoever happened to be standing close enough to hear it. Which brings us to the part of the legend that turns a strange discovery into something people still lower their voices to talk about. According to the story, it didn't take long. 2 days, maybe 3. After the men went in with lanterns and came back up talking about pillars and a doorway built on the wrong scale for a person, cars started showing up at the site that nobody on the crew recognized. Not Army Corps vehicles, not anything marked. Plain sedans, the kind every version of the story describes as government issue without ever quite settling on which government office they actually belong to. The men who stepped out of them wore suits instead of work clothes, flashed credentials fast enough that nobody on site got a clear look, and spoke only to the site supervisors, off to one side, away from the rest of the crew. By that evening, so the story goes, cameras were being collected. Not simply confiscated, but opened on the spot. The film pulled out and either torn straight into daylight or burned in a metal trash can, depending on which version you hear. Workers were pulled aside one at a time and asked to put their signature on a typed statement, the exact wording of which nobody who signed one has ever quoted directly, though every telling agrees on its general shape. An agreement to say nothing, to nobody, about anything they'd seen below the riverbed, with the clear understanding that there would be consequences if they didn't hold to it. The opening itself, the legend says, was gone within the week. Charges were set, and the tunnel mouth came down in what anyone watching from the overlooks would have read as routine safety work, clearing loose rock ahead of the water's eventual return. Nothing more remarkable than the ordinary business of an engineering project. Fresh concrete followed the rubble in, poured and finished off so cleanly that within a month there was nothing on that stretch of riverbed to suggest anything unusual had ever been found there. And here's the detail that keeps this legend alive, more than almost any other piece of it. The official public reason given that November for abandoning talus removal and letting the water back in without further digging was cost. Too expensive, the engineer said, not worth the expense against the benefit. Better to let the river shape the cliff the way it always had. That much is true. It's sitting right there in the record. But it's also, if you give the legend any weight at all, remarkably convenient timing for an explanation that closed the book on any further excavation of that riverbed, permanently, with several 100,000 gallons of water, a minute back over the top of it, before the year was out. There's one more small stubborn detail that keeps this version of the story circulating among people who like their legends, with a paper trail attached. The daily site log for the American Falls project, the kind of ordinary logbook every construction supervisor keeps, recording weather, manpower, equipment, and progress, is on file today with the historical materials from the 1969 project. According to more than one person who has gone looking for it over the years, the entries for 3 consecutive days in mid-June are unusually short. Not missing, not torn out, just uncharacteristically brief compared to every entry around them. A few clipped lines about weather and routine work where the surrounding pages run half a page or more. That could mean absolutely nothing. Logbooks get thin on slow days, but it's the kind of small, dry, unglamorous detail that a lot of skeptics find harder to shrug off than any amount of talk about staircases and stone doors. Because it doesn't ask you to believe in anything except that somebody, once, wrote less than they usually did. Nobody who claims to have actually worked that crew has ever gone fully on the record, name attached, in more than 50 years. A handful of old men, in their 80s and 90s, now, if they're living at all, have supposedly hinted at pieces of it over a drink in a bar close enough to hear the falls through the wall. Then gone quiet here the second somebody pulled out a notebook or held up a phone. That silence is either exactly what you'd expect from a crew of construction workers who genuinely saw nothing worth remembering 50-some years later, or it's exactly what you'd expect from men who were told, very clearly, a long time ago, what would happen if they didn't keep quiet about it. The legend has never resolved that question. It was never built to. On November 25th, 1969, the cofferdam came down, and the Niagara River roared back over the American Falls for the first time in more than 5 months, burying that stretch of riverbed under churning white water exactly where it's stayed ever since. If there really is a staircase down there, 30 feet wide and cut into solid stone, if there's a wall of fitted cyclopean blocks running back beneath the gorge, if there's a hall with pillars thick as silos and 2 stone doors 12 feet tall standing closed somewhere in the dark, it's been sitting under several 100,000 gallons of falling water a minute for more than 55 years now, and short of another full dewatering that nobody in Albany or Ottawa seems especially eager to fund. Nobody's likely to go check any time soon. So the story just keeps getting told instead. At Prospect Point, where visitors still lean over the same railing every single day, to watch the water fall exactly the way it has for roughly 12,000 years. A few of them, the ones who've heard some version of this story, find themselves looking a little longer than they meant to at the white water crashing down over ground, that might or might not still be hiding a staircase in the dark below it. Nobody can prove it's down there. Nobody has ever fully explained why so many separate threads, an actual dynamited cave at Bridal Veil, an actual massacre and an actual older tradition at Devil's Hole, quarrymen's false floors, canal diggers' bad ground, fishermen's booming mornings, and one strange, thinly documented week in June of 1969. All seem to circle the same stretch of hollow ground under the same waterfall. Nobody can prove the legend. Nobody can completely dismiss it either. If this story moved something in you, share it with one person, just one. The most enduring stories are the ones we keep alive, and the only way those tales survive is if enough of us refuse to stop telling them. Until next time. Keep looking at the shadows,